language literacy instructional methods by critically apprehending his notion of conscientization, a concept that is often misunderstood even by critical educators who claim to be Freirean, and conveniently dismissed by educators whose interest is to appropriate Freire's dialogical method, disarticulated from Freire's major theoretical goal, thus reducing him to a mere instructional methodologist. In addition to methods fetish of many educators, one of the challenges of defining Freire's original concept, conscientização, lies in the difficulty of pronouncing a Portuguese word. Portuguese speakers also experienced varied difficulty pronouncing it, and also in the fact that most definitions of this insightful concept rarely do justice to what Freire had in mind. Freire always insisted that before we even attempt to define conscientização, we need to adhere to the essence of this concept and ask, what definition, against what, for whom, and against whom? If we begin to answer these questions, we soon realize that, even for many followers of Freire's thinking, conscientização presents a certain difficulty beyond the hurdles of its correct pronunciation, being a term that Freire, at least initially, refused to have translated into English by simply stating, "I refuse." Why not accept this term? I do not have to accept stress, but I have. Why do you not accept conscientização? Freire eventually agreed to have his term translated into the approximate English translation, conscientization. For Freire, the demystification of conscientization would necessarily have to include the reclaiming of the oppressed's own words as a process of coming to voice, which he viewed as the fundamental theme of the Third World, implying a difficult but not impossible task for its people, which is the conquest of its right to voice, of the right to pronounce its word. It is this right that the oppressed need to reclaim in order to speak their word, the right to be themselves, to assume direction of their destiny. It is this right that the dominant forces go to great lengths to suffocate, seeking to sequester the words of the oppressed, words that unveil the mechanism of oppression and are distorted or repressed, as Henri Giraud suggests, in a society that revels in bouts of historical and social amnesia, in which it is much easier for the language of politics and community to be stolen and deployed like a weapon, so as to empty words such as democracy, freedom, justice, and the social state of any viable meaning. The sequestration of language by dominant forces of oppression, and even by liberal educators who proselytize about empowering minorities and giving them voice when they themselves represent the majority, is evident in the overuse and abuse of euphemisms in academic discourses and mainstream media. Euphemism is a form of language that not only mystifies and distorts reality, it is also a much-used technique by dominant forces, the media, political pundits, the educated class, to distract attention from the real issues that ail society, such as the obscene widening of the income gap between the rich and the poor, the pernicious shrinking of the middle class, and the generalized alienation of the dispossessed. The suppression or distortion of language is a tactic that, according to Arunti Roy, also appears as usurping words and deploying them like weapons, using them to mask intent and to mean exactly the opposite of what they have traditionally meant, has been one of the most brilliant strategic victories of czars in the new dispensation. It has allowed them to marginalize their detractors, deprive them of a language to voice their critique. When the technique of sequestration fails to work, the dominant forces engage in more draconian measures, as was evident when a Tucson public schools official in Arizona banned Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed from classrooms because, according to a superintendent of the Arizona Department of Education, we should not be teaching kids that they're oppressed. In other words, conscientization, as a process to acquire the necessary critical thinking tools so that students, instead of internalizing their oppression, understand how institutions of power work to deny them equality of treatment, access, and justice, is not a goal of Tucson public schools, where courses that deal with issues such as race relations, ethics, and ideology are banned, and teachers are encouraged to promote a pedagogy of big lies through which students, in this case lower-class Mexican-American students, can be more easily domesticated. The almost total lack of public outcry in the United States regarding the censorship of books and the heightening of language that names reality in order to contest oppression may prove to be the keystone of our undoing. I'm amazed to witness academics engage in euphemisms as they aggressively object to any discourse that both fractures the dominant language and lays bare the veiled reality in order to name it. It is still more amazing to witness educators who claim to be Freirean fail to see the obvious impossibility of the oppressed apprehending through the process of conscientization a deepened consciousness of their situation as an historical reality susceptible of transformation, while these liberal educators remain complicit in the erasure of language, an act that empties out, for example, the meaning of the term oppressed. Many of these liberals eagerly embrace euphemisms such as disadvantaged, disenfranchised, economically marginal, minority and at risk, among others, to refer to the oppressed, but in doing so obfuscate the true historical conditions that explain the here and now, which constitutes the situation within which the oppressed are submerged, from which they emerge, and in which they intervene to denounce and confront their oppressors in the pursuit of full humanity. This sequestration of language denies people the possibility to understand the dialectical relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed. If you have an oppressed, you must have an oppressor. Thus, language is not only a site of contestation, it is also an indispensable tool for a critical reflexive demystification process that is central to conscientization, a process which Freire refuses to vulgarize and reduce to mere methods to be consumed by the so-called first-world progressive educators who, in many instances, remain chained to the mystification of methods and techniques, and indeed a reduction of conscientization to certain methods and techniques used in Latin America for adult literacy. Hence, Freire's major goal, as I had mentioned earlier, was not to develop a literacy methodology to be used universally with oppressed people of the world. His main goal was to use literacy and the subsequent methods he developed for particular groups of adult learners to lead people to conscientization. In other words, no matter where we come from, all of us are involved in a permanent process of conscientization, as thinking beings in a dialectical relation with an objective reality upon which we act. What varies in time and space are the contents, methods, and objectives of conscientization, when human beings become aware and made themselves capable of revealing their active reality, knowing it and understanding what they know. Another critical misunderstanding of conscientization is to view the concept as a kind of tropical exoticism, a typically third-world entity. People speak of conscientization as an inviolable goal for complex societies, as though the third-world nations were not complex in their own way. This false dichotomy between the so-called First World and Third World represents yet another sequestration of language designed to lead to a form of mystification, a distraction that functions as a reproductive mechanism designed to create a center or a core of romanticized Eurocentric values, while relegating other cultural expressions to the margins. The current attacks on Islam and on Muslims in general are a case in point, where Western media, political pundits, and academics often totalize religio-cultural extremists and generalize the extremism to all Muslims, framing them all as potential terrorists. At the same time, we conveniently ignore extremists of the West, like evangelist Pat Robertson, who camouflages his bigotry and his constant attacks on women. Take, for example, Robertson's statement that the feminist agenda is not about equal rights for women. It's about a socialist, anti-family political movement that encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians. If one substituted Robertson with a Taliban cleric and switched the words socialist and capitalism, the Western political class, the media, and other non-Muslim religious leaders would have a field day attacking the primitive nature of Islam and its radicalism, while ignoring the diversity within the Muslim world that consists of billions of people from different cultures, classes, and ethnicities. Hence, institutional mechanisms in the West and in much of the world function by and large to contain and maintain these so-called primitive third world cultures that are often silenced by the incessant speech of the dominant culture, so as to make these silent sections of cultures invisible or at least outside the parameters of public discussion or debate. Engaging Freire's conscientization process could help reveal the West's penchant for engaging in the construction of invisibility to keep the submerged cultures invisible and also to hide the West's own extremism, which is no less terroristic than Muslim extremism. How else would we characterize the American savagery in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Vietnam that often extended to the utmost depravity, gratuitous torture, killing for target practice, slaughter of children and babies, slaughter that pro-life advocate Pat Robertson and his ilk conveniently refused to address in ethical and political terms? Our inability or unwillingness to engage a conscientization process is why we can easily accept Pat Robertson's blatant lies about feminism, even as we embrace the false dichotomy encoded in the distinction between first world and third world contexts, an ideological distinction that primarily functions to reproduce the Western narrative of third world savage and primitive cultures, which in turn call for the West to exercise its moral responsibility to slaughter children and babies in order to save them from themselves, a slaughter justified by an American military superior in the Marines as tough shit. They grow up to be VC, Viet Cong. Too many Americans also remain silent when drones and smart bombs kill women and children indiscriminately in Afghanistan and Pakistan, while the United States presents itself as an advocate for women's rights and freedoms. Western media, political pundits, and most academics also remain silent with respect to the West's extremism, as revealed in the classic former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright's response of 1996 to the reported 500,000 Iraqi children, casualties of the sanctions of mass destruction. It was worth it. Social construction of not seeing with respect to the United States foreign policy is not all that different from the phenomenon of some academics and researchers who are busily writing grant proposals to study and promote, for example, literacy in Haiti, while ignoring the tens of thousands of Haitians in the United States who are struggling and dropping out of the public schools that often surround their universities. The devastating 2010 earthquake in Haiti and the subsequent cholera epidemic that was brought by the United Nations troops has put Haiti on the radar of Western countries whose response has exemplified a kind of paternalism turned into charitable racism, which, according to Albert Memmi, is a consubstantial part of colonialism. White academics and researchers go to Haiti to collect data and anthropologize the suffering Haitians who are the subjects of their study, returning to their U.S. campuses to tell exotic stories to their students and colleagues, publish their research studies, and obtain tenure, while tens of thousands of Haitians remain in Haiti, sentenced to slum conditions and making cookies out of mud to trick their stomachs that they are full and therefore not hungry. Further, these anthropological tourists that go to Haiti to study Haitians and collect data often discriminate against Haitian students who take their classes in the United States. I remember asking a white American professor who often went to Haiti as part of research projects sponsored by federal grants in the 1980s why he did not devote some of his time working with the thousands of Haitians who surrounded his university. His response was honest, if not pathetic. The funding agencies do not find Haitians in the U.S. sexy enough. Had this liberal first world academic engaged in an honest and rigorous conscientization process, he would probably not have remained so comfortable making a career off the trials of millions of Haitians who remain chained to inhumanity, savage inequality, and human misery. Had he been able to make a linkage between his careerist goals and the reproduction of oppression in Haiti, largely supported by U.S. foreign policy, he would probably have detected the pathology of his honest answer. This researcher might have developed a deeper comprehension of Haitians and understood that their current life conditions had been shaped in large part by American interventionist policies through invasions of Haiti, its occupation, and the perpetual support for right-wing dictators, who work largely against the interests of the vast majority of Haitians. By engaging in a form of honest reflection and self-interrogation, the white American researcher would possibly have realized that his political project is, first and foremost, the advancement of his career. Had this First World academic made these linkages, he would likely have denounced the almost sainthood status bestowed upon former President Clinton and former President Bush Sr. for their humanitarian work in Haiti after the deadly earthquake. This white American educator might have come to see that both former presidents were partly responsible, through their foreign policies, for the sea of human misery that predated the earthquake. What the earthquake did was both exacerbate the subhuman conditions to which tens of thousands of Haitians were relegated and make them public in the same manner that Hurricane Katrina exposed the structural racism and dehumanization of African Americans in New Orleans. Notwithstanding the horror of the Haitian earthquake, the First World liberal educator would probably refuse to pay $1,320 a night per room in a luxury 5-star royal hotel overlooking the shantytown's shacks and tents, and which was constructed with $7.5 million from the World Bank's International Finance Corporation and $2 million from the Clinton-Bush Haiti Fund. While this obscene display of First World opulence, if not decadence, marked the humanitarian generosity of First World countries, over 1 million Haitians displaced by the earthquake remain homeless and continue to exist in subhuman conditions, living in shacks and tents without plumbing or running water, without electricity, and without much to feed themselves and their families. Had the First World educator engaged in the process of conscientization, he would possibly be able to detect the false piety demonstrated by former Presidents Bush and Clinton as they were greeted by thousands of Haitians in Port-au-Prince. Former President Bush's condescending disdain for Haitian people became quite evident on YouTube all over the world when he tried to wipe his hand after shaking it with a Haitian man in the crowd, on former President Clinton's shirt. The conscientization process might have lifted the veil of privilege that the Blands enjoy in Haiti. These are the white or outsiders, foreigners who fall in love with the exotic narrative of Haiti that they create to fulfill their colonial desires and meet their own needs, a narrative that has, in many respects, little to do with the reality that Haitians experience on a daily basis as they try to survive. In many ways, these First World Blands, regardless of their political orientation, fail to understand how their brand of intervention is nothing like Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, which is animated by authentic humanist, not humanitarian generosity, that presents itself as pedagogy of humankind. Pedagogy which begins with the egoistic interests of the oppressors, an egoism cloaked in the false generosity of paternalism, and makes the oppressed the objects of its humanitarianism, itself maintains and embodies oppression. It is an instrument of dehumanization. Humanitarianism, as the embodiment of dehumanization, is best exemplified by the Red Cross, a charitable organization which collected over $400 million to alleviate the suffering of tens of thousands of Haitians displaced and made homeless by the earthquake, and has as its signature the building of a luxury hotel costing millions of dollars while over 1 million Haitians remain homeless. While lavish hotels can provide stress relief for the army of NGOs and other humanitarian help as they celebrate happy hour with other Bland's friends and co-workers who command First World salaries, tens of thousands of Haitians continue to struggle to put a roof over their heads and scavenge enough to eat so they can reclaim their ontological and historical vocation to be more fully human. While foreign workers maintain the material conditions to access 5-star restaurants and healthcare services, including psychological therapy, most Haitians displaced by the 2010 earthquake yearn to know what it means to be fully human. Take, for example, Amy Willence's characterization of Mac McClelland, a human rights reporter for Mother Jones who acquired PTSD like it was a cold virus by watching a recently raped Haitian woman collapse at a chance of sighting her attacker. Thus traumatized, McClelland published an account of the home therapy she elected, arranging for a friend to rape her with the maximum verisimilitude their relationship would allow. While McClelland's choice of therapy for the exposure to violence in her humanitarian work in the aftermath of the earthquake in Haiti smacks of narcissism on steroids, in varying degrees it also represents the embedded egoism cloaked in the false generosity of paternalism of the oppressor's humanitarian interventions, packaged as charitable gifts which, in turn, encapsulate the self-centered benevolence of the First World Order. These charitable interventions have not only been, for the most part, huge failures, as in the case of Haiti, but First World humanitarians fail to understand that liberation comes only through a process of resolution of tensions and contradictions in the relation between the oppressor and the oppressed. Hence, if the goal of the oppressed is to become fully human, they do not achieve their goal by merely reversing the terms of the contradiction by changing poles. By the same token, the oppressor cannot expect to liberate the oppressed by reversing the poles so as to experience directly the violence of oppression. This is the continuation of the oppressor's need to appropriate even the oppressed's suffering, as McClelland's case seems to indicate. McClelland's choice of therapy is tantamount to the phenomenon of many liberal educators who feel that they need to make a public statement regarding their divestment from the dominating bureaucracy from which they have always reaped benefits, by moving their families into the ghettos temporarily until their own kids have to go to school. According to Freire, liberation is never about the democratization of violence, human misery, and obscene poverty. Liberation that resolves the contradictions between the oppressor and the oppressed can only do so by the appearance of the new man and woman, neither oppressor nor oppressed, but man and woman in the process of liberation. The inability to resolve the contradictions between the oppressor and the oppressed, to make linkages and to become a tramp of the obvious, as Freire would say, is directly related to what Freire identified in The Pedagogy of the Oppressed as the failings of a prevalent banking model of education, a process through which education thus becomes an act of depositing, in which the students are the depositories and the teacher is the depositor. Instead of communicating, the teacher issues communiques and makes deposits while the students patiently receive, memorize, and repeat. This is the banking concept of education, in which the scope of action allowed to the students extends only as far as receiving, filling, and storing the deposits. The banking model of education is largely at work in instrumental literacy programs for the poor, in the form of a competency-based skills banking approach to schooling, and even through higher education, the highest form of instrumental literacy for the rich, acquired in the form of professional specialization. However, despite their apparent differences, the two approaches share one common feature. They both prevent the development of critical thinking that enables one to read the world critically and to understand the reasons and linkages and behind what may appear seemingly obvious but remains ill understood. Literacy for the poor through the banking concept of education is by large characterized by mindless, meaningless drills and exercises given in preparation for multiple choice exams and writing gobbledygook in imitation of the psychobabble that surrounds them. This banking and instrumental approach to education sets the stage for the anesthetization of the mind, as poet John Ashbery eloquently captures in What is Poetry? In school, all the thoughts got combed out. What was left was like a field. The educational comb for those teachers who have uncritically accepted the banking model of education is embodied in practice sheets and workbooks, in mindless computer drills and practices that mark and control the pace of routinization. This drill and practice assembly line numbing the student's capacity for thought, leaves the ground prepared for the teacher's instruction, where the narration with the teacher as narrator leads the students to memorize mechanically the narrated content. Worse yet, it turns them into containers, into receptacles to be filled by the teacher. The more meekly the receptacles permit themselves to be filled, the better students they are. The students are then measured by high-stakes tests that reflect an often militaristic, controlled transaction of the teacher's narration and the student's memorization of the mechanically narrated content. Hence, the dominant effects of this mechanistic banking education inevitably create educational structures that favor rote learning and necessarily reduce the priorities of education to the pragmatic requirements of capital, anesthetizing students' critical abilities in order to domesticate social order for its self-preservation. At the other end of the spectrum, the domestication of the social order is achieved by an equally mechanistic approach to education for the rich, via the hyper-specialization that, on the one hand, deposits high-level skills and, on the other, discourages the linkages of different bodies of knowledge in the name of pure and specialized science that produces a specialist subject who, according to the Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset, knows very well his own tiny corner of the universe, but is radically ignorant of all the rest. In fact, this inability to make linkages between different bodies of knowledge often produces a level of arrogance exemplified by a math professor in a major university when she stated that she has the right of not knowing. This statement was made in reference to the news coverage of the Iraq War, when, perhaps because she was feeling uncomfortable with her colleagues' open opposition to the war, she abruptly proclaimed, "I have a right not to know the news." While she has the right to choose not to know, as an academic and citizen in a democratic society, she has the responsibility of knowing what her leaders are doing, and might better choose to know when human rights are being threatened, for example, by policies full of barbarism, policies that enable horrors like the drone-guided bombing of targets that invariably include the carnage of innocent civilians, women, and children, which policymakers consider an unfortunate part of war or simply collateral damage. The authoritarian insensitivity and total disrespect for human life was again on display when the Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte instructed the Navy and Coast Guard that if they are kidnappers and they are trying to escape, bomb them all. They say hostage, sorry, collateral damage. The social organization of knowledge, by a rigidly defined disciplinary boundaries, further contributes to the formation of the specialist class, that is, engineers, doctors, professors, and so on, with each profession subdivided into more constricted areas of focus. This sort of specialist is only acquainted with one science, and even of that one knows only the small corner in which he is an active investigator. He even proclaims it as a virtue that he takes no cognizance of what lies outside the narrow territory, specially cultivated by himself, and gives the name dilettantism to any curiosity for the general scheme of knowledge. This dilettantism is discouraged through the mythical need to discover absolute objective truth within one's narrow specialization, and in the process, it domesticates a form of specialized knowledge that not only produces a rupture with philosophies of social and cultural relations, that foregrounds a plurality of culturally embedded perspectives and knowledges, but also hides behind an ideology that creates and sustains false dichotomies, rigidly delineated by disciplinary boundaries. This ideology also informs the view that hard science, objectivity, and scientific rigor must be disarticulated from the messy data of soft science, and from the social and political practices that generate these categories in the first place. In addition, this banking model of education produces a fragmentation of knowledge that invariably diminishes the student's critical awareness in favor of accepting reality as a given, and as a consequence, undermines the critical consciousness which would result from their intervention in the world as transformers of that world. The more completely they accept the passive role imposed on them, the more they tend simply to adapt to the world as it is, and to the fragmented view of reality deposited in it. The dire result is that occupiers of the most privileged class, with the greatest wealth and opportunity, thus renounce their ontological vocation as agents of history, who might not only transform their world, but also reflect on that transformation. According to Freire, the capability of banking education to minimize or annul the student's creative power and to stimulate their credulity serves the interest of the oppressors, who care neither to have the world revealed nor see it transformed. The banking model of education is also often used as a safe haven for most conservative and many liberal educators who conceal their materialist and consumerist conception of education in what Freire calls a digestive concept of knowledge, so common in current educational practice, a practice that considers students to be undernourished and, as a result, leads the teacher to feel compelled to give students an unrealistic list of readings that are never really covered or discussed in class under the pretext that the student's consciousness is spatialized and must be filled in order to know. I'm reminded of a professor who gave his students a syllabus containing a reading list totaling 80 pages, knowing all too well that it is impossible to rigorously discuss all of these readings in a one-semester course, a pedagogy that certainly celebrates quantity over quality. The same professor required students to write a 40-page paper. Why not 25, 35, or 38? Pages that he hardly read, much less provided extensive and insightful comments. In a student's corrected 54-page paper, the professor provided short comments that did not go beyond 2 to 5 words, such as excellent job, high versus low culture, great, or pedagogical forces. In short, an entire 54-page paper received a total of 43 words and comments. This nutritionist approach to education follows the same conception that led Jean-Paul Sartre, when criticizing the notion that to know is to eat, to exclaim, "Oh, philosophie élémentaire," a process where words are transformed into mere deposits of vocabulary, the teacher's vocabulary, the bread of the spirit which the students are to eat and digest, the teacher's knowledge, that is, definition lists without the apprehension of the object of knowledge, methods as a toolkit divorced from awareness of how their use inscribes certain ideologies, particularly now as applied to new technologies, formulaic texts masquerading as theory that belittles practice, and ample glossaries. Incessantly fed information as unthinking receptacles, students are later asked to vomit it back in the mandated exams and tests designed on one hand to confirm the teacher's superior knowledge bank account and on the other to feed his or her narcissistic needs, a motive inherent in most humanitarian, not humanist approaches to education. In the end, the nutritionist banking approach to education, even when offered under the guise of progressive education, has as its major goal the fattening of the student's brain through the deposits of the teacher's knowledge, and thus, under the pedagogical